Sunset Strip. J.D. Salinger presents
Ghibli films. What do they mean? Do they mean things? Let's find out. I've been watching Studio Ghibli films for many years now, and I've considered them to be in a league of their own when it comes to animated feature films for about as long. A large part of my sustained interest is due to my childhood dream of being the first weeb in space. But absent that, I think it's because the movies are not just well produced, they're beholden to the heart. It is my opinion that Ghibli films speak to something deep in the soul as much as any great work of art does.
Many citizens believe there are fundamental.
And as a kid who loved anime, Ghibli was often the exception allowed by others who weren't as fond of the medium or who did not agree that anime was art. If they'd seen the likes of Spirited Away, they often set that one aside when feeling the need to tell me anime is trash. And look, sometimes anime is trash. We all know it, I gain nothing from denying the truth, but it is rather weird that so many extrapolate outwards from this anime is trash to all anime is trash because, well, anime is a varied medium. There is a lot of it, and no matter what you hear, it is not all the same. So we've established I like Ghibli films, but does that even matter? I mean, only in so much as you might ask yourself why I'm spending so long talking about them. I think what matters far more is what the films say themselves, and in the case of Studio Ghibli, a lot of these movies are thematically alike. Yet, I think they represent different perspectives, even in the case where there are the same individuals present for the creation of multiple films. Are there patterns to spot amongst multiple Ghibli films? Undoubtedly. But each one has its own unique perspective and its own world to share. In short, I'm going to be talking about Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind in this video, and even reference other Ghibli films. But the primary question I want to answer today is, what does Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind have to say? And how is that message relevant to today in 2025? Is it about the environment? Absolutely. But it isn't some singularity. It isn't about a single action, but about humanity's role in the world. Yes, as it stands with the environment, but I think it's reductive to say this story is just about environmental causes. It's more about how we choose to tackle problems like the environment. When we look inward, what is it that guides our choices? Let's start talking about Nausicaä by putting the film into its proper context. Part 1. Studio Ghibli, 40 years on. In 1985, while Tears for Fears was falling head over heels, Madonna was going crazy for you, and the Eurythmics were asking, would I lie to you? Studio Ghibli was being founded. That makes 2025 the 40th anniversary of Studio Ghibli's founding and marks 40 years of Totoro's, adaptations of stories like Howl's Moving Castle, The Little Mermaid, The Borrowers, and even the international launch of a public service announcement warning of the dangers of tanuki scrotum. More fatal than you might think. Ghibli became a homegrown favorite media production company early on in Japan, but was truly catapulted to international success after its film Princess Mononoke broke a 15-year record at the box office when it unexpectedly grossed over $160 million in 1997, only to have that record broken in 2001 by Spirited Away, which today is the third highest grossing Japanese film of all time. And you know what film Princess Mononoke dethroned in Japan? The film that inspired a literal decade of night terrors in yours truly, Steven Spielberg's E.T., which had grossed about $133 million in 1983. But Princess Mononoke and myself have the film Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind to thank for breaking the hold that that evil little space toddler held.
I'll be right here.
In truth, Nausicaä was a film produced before the official founding of Studio Ghibli. Ghibli was founded by directors Hayao Miyazaki, Isao Takahata, and producer Toshio Suzuki after Takahata and Suzuki purchased the studio named Topcraft under the parent company Tokuma Shoten. They later renamed Topcraft to Studio Ghibli, and they immediately went to work on producing feature-length animated films. This was years after Takahata and Miyazaki had made their directorial debuts. In his book, Sharing a House with the Never-Ending Man, Steve Alpert, who worked as head of Ghibli's parent company's international division of Tokuma Shoten, say that 5 times fast, recounts the conflicting stories of how they arrived at Ghibli's name. Toshio Suzuki has said that the name for the studio was chosen because Ghibli is a term World War I Italian fighter pilots used for the hot wind that blows out of the Sahara Desert. Suzuki maintained that Ghibli's purpose was to blow a hot new wind into the world of Japanese film animation, which I must say is a rather poetic and marketing-friendly story of the name, as opposed to Miyazaki's account. Miyazaki says he was looking at a book of World War I aircraft when Suzuki came in, and randomly pointed to a plane he had open at the time. Nausicaä was selected as the first film to create with Topcraft, with Miyazaki at the helm. He directed it because the story was also already of Miyazaki's creation. He had written a serialized manga version of Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind in the anime magazine Animage, which was also owned by Tokuma Shoten and where Suzuki was an editor. It is really thanks to the success of Nausicaä that the model for business was proven well enough to Tokuma Shoten's owner and head, Yasuyoshi Tokuma, who secured Suzuki the funds needed for them to go and purchase Topcraft. Which means that though Nausicaä was produced before Ghibli's official founding, it is considered solidly a part of the Ghibli canon, and not just because it was the film that helped get them into the position to open Ghibli, but because Ghibli was founded with the goal of keeping the Topcraft team that worked on Nausicaä together. Miyazaki was already someone that was respected in the field of animation, but he was also a persnickety sort, particular about how he worked. And though creating the film version of Nausicaä had plenty of daunting challenges, it was ultimately a team and a process he was able to leverage to complete the project. Once he found such a method and a team that worked for him, he wanted to continue that trajectory. Nausicaa's manga, however, was not completed. In fact, it wouldn't be complete until March of 1994, a full decade after the film launched. And in a lot of ways, Miyazaki liked having films to produce because it gave him a good excuse to put work on the manga aside, as he found it to be both fulfilling, yes, but daunting. In an interview for the June 1994 edition of Yomu, produced by Iwanami Shoten, Miyazaki said, "I didn't have enough confidence in the direction of the manga story when I resumed it after the film. There were aspects of the film story I wasn't able to shake off, and I really had to force myself to continue. To be more honest, I should say that when I had to temporarily stop work on the manga serialization in order to make my next film, I felt such a huge sense of relief that it was almost as though I had fled from my desk. It is not something I'm proud to say, but when work on the next film ended, even after I had taken a bit of a break, I still found it agonizing to go back to the Nausicaä manga. I ultimately wound up stopping the serialization 4 times. In a lot of ways, though, Nausicaa's story was a product of the times it was created in, both in its early days and as it developed into the film adaptation, and into the conclusion of the manga as well. Nausicaa's manga started in the early 80s. It was a time in the world where a lot of speculative fiction was looking at what humanity was doing to the Earth, what it could do to the Earth in the name of self-defense, or what we could do to each other.
Part 2. The 1980s, a tumultuous time in a long line of tumultuous times.
Humans grapple with a lot. Poverty, starvation, access to medical supplies, an ever-changing landscape and climate, a scary political climate, and we've been grappling with a lot of these issues for a long time. One thing that I think most would agree on is that the 20th century increased the scale by which we can fixate on global issues. Here in the US, the 80s are marked by the heights of the Cold War, where the prior decades of US policy of containment of the communist threat was in full swing. Nations had their own problems, but were also embroiled in a clique-like power struggle where a line was drawn. Were you a part of the free world? A term that was originally used to describe the Western Bloc of World War II, including the likes of the Soviets, who fought with the Allies in the conflict, but had shifted meaning after the war to be about democratic values, of which capitalism was a core tenet.
Inflation was a problem in the 80s, and cocaine was really out of the price range of almost all of us. Crack came along and was much more affordable.
Or were you a part of the encroaching tide of communism, which was framed as very much antithetical to freedom?
The impact of Gorbachev's secession to the power on the Geneva arms talks. But first, when we return, Nightline correspondent James Walker looks at the issues the two superpowers must deal with at Geneva.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Sears.
The 80s for the US and its allies, which included Japan, were almost a show of economic strength. It was about the wonders of global capitalism and its reach, or at least that's how VH1's I Love the 80s likes to frame things.
You know, just following around these people and their mansions and yachts and Rolls Royces.
Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous is a show that details in excruciating detail all the things you will never have.
Ed thinks it is the perfect choice if you're having a party, and he hopes you will invite a lot of friends because he has certainly picked a lot of fruit.
For Japan, it was certainly a period marked by economic growth, even with some hurdles in that arena. Business was booming in Japan, where we saw anime and manga become more established as long-term entertainment industries that weren't falling out of fashion anytime soon. The release of some of the most famous franchises in the video game industry, like Super Mario Bros., Donkey Kong, and other hits that remain popular to this day.
Luigi's in a bind, giant turtles out to get him, creepy crabs are right behind, fireflies, cheaper shikes, they're all coming out the pipes. Mario, where are you?
Now, many people in the US today remember the impact of the impending threat of nuclear war with the Soviets as another defining characteristic of the 1980s. Not only would Japan not be immune to those sentiments just because they were not the US or the USSR, but they were arguably one of the nations in the world with the most anxiety about the threat of nuclear war, being the only nation to have ever experienced the devastation that nuclear weapons can inflict. They were geographically in an awkward position, being close to the USSR, while economically and politically allied very strongly with the US. Though many of the Japanese did protest the extended military presence of the US throughout Japan, that presence did serve as a deterrent for Soviet influence, which I think was the obvious goal of the US in the first place. Japan had seen the horrors of nuclear weapons firsthand, and it seemed impossible to imagine that they would not be impacted by general sentiment surrounding its threat. And as is often the case, anxiety about those issues tends to show up in the media being produced by those peoples. One of the most well-known media icons to come out of Japan was born of that very anxiety. Godzilla was first released in 1954, and it is well documented that Godzilla is a symbol of the potential results of nuclear weapons. As recently as April of 2024, we have articles like this one by Al Jazeera where they quote Kazu Watanabe from his 2020 interview with NBC. At the time, he was the head of film at the Japan Society, a cultural society in New York City. As long as nuclear weapons or nuclear power exists, Godzilla will never not be relevant. Godzilla reminds us that we have the terrible power to create our own monsters and contribute to our own destruction. Though Godzilla's role in media shifted through the years, there is no divorcing it from that original context. But things certainly changed in the world and in Japan in the 30 years between Godzilla's release and the release of Nausicaä. If Godzilla is a film where the central monster is symbolic of the fears Japan felt at what nuclear weapons may do to their society, then I think Nausicaä was born from the anxiety of what it means to live so close to a part of the Earth that still bore scars from these weapons, and even more so at being brought into conflict between other nations due to a balance of proximity and periphery. of being a nation without their own standing army, yet subject to the whims of those who do have such forces at their disposal. And I think I'm at least partially correct in terms of just how the world state at the time of Nausicaa's conception was absolutely part of Miyazaki's thought process. Going back to that interview in the June 1994 edition of Yomu, which was celebrating the completion of the manga version of Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind, Miyazaki was asked what kind of story he set out to make. One thing I do remember well, however, is that I was extremely irritated at the time. I confess I was angry about the general state of the world, among other things. It was right around 1980. In addition to being upset by environmental problems, I was also concerned about where humanity was headed, and especially about the state of Japan. Most of all, I suspect, I was angered by the state of my own self. In Nausicaä, it's the people of the Valley of the Wind who exist on this knife's edge of being at the mercy of other nations and nature itself. And there are fears of what those pressures could do to the people of the valley, how it could change them for the worse, or how they could potentially refuse to participate in the actions that may help themselves in the long run, and who exist as an analog for a humbler view of the everyday person who simply must make a living in a world where others are making war.
Part 3. The Valley of the Wind. Not just a clever nickname for a butt.
The film starts by showing us glimpses of the new wilderness of the world. We get shots of the decaying forest, and even some views of a former human settlement that has become overrun by the forest. The world we find ourselves in is one that is more hostile to humanity, and exists in an uneasy balance of power between nations. What's clear is that this world was irrevocably changed by the weapons of the old world, which didn't just change the landscape or the ecosystem, but seemingly plunged humans into a dark age. Some knowledge survived, while some remains lost. There are habitable places like the Valley of the Wind, as well as places like Pegite, or where the Imperial Tolmekians live. But a significant portion of the known world is covered in the sprawling fungused forest known as the Sea of Corruption, or the Forest of Decay, or the Toxic Jungle, where humans need specialized equipment like masks and goggles to traverse without breathing in the air themselves. In fact, the Valley of the Wind is notable for being very close to the forest, and it's the very winds from which the valley draws its name that make it so they can live there at all. The wind comes from the salt sea and blows through the valley, pushing out any of the spores released from the Sea of Corruption that could become an issue. But how did we get here? It all started in what is referred to as the 7 Days of Fire, in which beings called the Giant God Warriors apparently ended the world of that age. In the wake of that destruction, which is heavily implied to be the origin of the Sea of Corruption, humanity did survive. Exactly how much time has passed since then is anyone's guess, but you can still find relics of the old world around, including the remains of giant god warriors themselves. Now, it's at this time I should clarify that though I will compare the film version of Nausicaä to the manga from time to time in this video, the focus is on the film. The manga did come first, and the two versions diverge pretty early on in the storyline, but I will share some of the details of the world building of the manga because, in general, it's a bit more complex than what the movie gets into. The Valley of the Wind in this world is part of a region called the Periphery, that is home to independent states that live near the Sea of Corruption. They are autonomous states, but they do owe some allegiance to the Kingdom of Tolmekiä. Essentially, Tolmekiä allows these regions their autonomy, but can call on them if needed for military support. That is why the valley has a gunship, a relic from the old world, in the first place. They have the knowledge to maintain it, but not to build new gunships themselves. Instead, they seem to scavenge needed parts from old, derelict gunships that they still have access to. Part of the ancient treaty between the Valley of the Wind and Tolmekiä is that the chieftain of the valley must serve as a pilot of their gunship in the Tolmekian army if so called upon. As the only living child and princess of the valley, this duty would fall to Nausicaä herself, at least theoretically. This treaty goes back 300 years to the fall of the Kingdom of Eftal. The remains of Eftal became Tolmekiä and the peripheral states. For 300 years, these people went about their business, but that business varied. There were those in the business of looking to the past, to the lost technologies of the old world, and to a time when humanity didn't live in fear of the sea of corruption. Some of these factions want to only use the power they unearth to destroy the sea, while others see the added option of imposing their rule, or at least their supremacy, on other similar powers in the continent. The Valley, however, is looking to keep to itself. It is a small city-state of about 500 people. They grow their own crops that they must tend to carefully and with a keen eye, looking out for any errant spores. They generate power with a series of windmills as another benefit of the winds from the salt sea. They pray to the wind itself as it has allowed them to live in this land. Though the wind does protect them from the most overt effects of the forest, it can't protect them completely. Such proximity inevitably affects the health of the people who live there, with Nausicaa's own father, Jill, the chieftain of the valley, seeing his health decline quite quickly. He had 11 children, but only Nausicaä survived and is therefore his only heir. And as his ability to move slips away, he is forced to allow Nausicaä to take on the role of chieftain. Though he is still sick from exposure to the sea of corruption over many years, in the film version of the story, he does not succumb to this sickness and is instead murdered by the recently arrived Tomekian troops. I'm not a huge fan of this change, but I'll talk more about that when we get to Nausicaä herself. For now, it is important to state that when Tomekiä shows up in the valley, they immediately get rid of Nausicaa's father and essentially take her as a political prisoner to get the cooperation of the people of the valley. I'm of the opinion that they may have achieved similar results, even just pretending to honor the treaties between Tomekiä and the valley, but the fact that they didn't, and seemingly didn't even think to do so much as look up the details of the treaty, does provide a fair bit of characterization for Tomekiä. They are ultimately an arrogant nation that thinks very little of the people who live in the periphery. The Tomekians in the film are led by a member of the Tomekian royal family, Kushana. In truth, she's the daughter of the previous emperor of Tomekiä, and the current Vai-emperor has taken her mother as a bride and thus taken up the throne himself. He's had 3 sons, who all come before Kushana by virtue of them being boys. Kushana is actually the eldest of the children, and the only surviving child of the previous emperor, but due to her gender, that's all denied to her, something she knows and resents. While the rest of the Tomekian forces are working to wage war against Tomekia's biggest rival on the continent, Dorok, she was given charge of the Periphery campaign, something she views as an obvious slight and a means of getting rid of her. There are other peripheral states besides the Valley of the Wind, but for the most part they play no real role in the film, with the exception of Pejite. Pejite was an industrial city in the periphery, and it was unique in that it still had a lot of old world artifacts like engines buried beneath the city that they'd excavate, repair, and sell. They'd done this for generations, yet what changed things was when they uncovered a god warrior that was still able to be powered on. Other god warriors were mere skeletons, but this one was still somewhat alive and had the means to potentially return it back to its full glory.
It was said that a monster from the old world was unearthed from deep beneath the city of Pejite, a giant warrior.
This is an element that could change the power structure in the region for good, and there were even those in Pejite, like Asbel, who were in favor of using the god warrior's strength to do something thought impossible: destroy the Sea of Corruption. But Pejite was in no condition to defend themselves or their find from the Tomekians, and Kushana saw an opportunity to raise herself above her brothers by doing the impossible of bringing a god warrior back into the fold. Unfortunately for the valley, they were in between the lands of Tomekiä and the city-state of Pejite. And given that both Pejite and Tomekiä were not very fond of understanding the Sea of Corruption and how to traverse it, and in their haste, both drew the ire of the bugs who inhabited this no man's land. Yes, we are this far into the video, and nary a mention of bugs. Sorry about that. We'll get to the bugs, make no mistake. But bugs are the domain of nature, and what I really want to convey in this section is that there is a complex network of human societies that are all interacting in the lands where the bugs don't really tread, unless it's to chase down an offensive party of humans. There is political strife between these tiny nations that are autonomous, but only insofar as the military powers in the continent will allow. And if given the opportunity, these military powers take what they want without much care for who they left behind. The Valley and Pejite are proud peoples. They value that autonomy. In fact, in the manga, it is not the murder of the Valley's chieftain that first enrages Nausicaä into potential conflict with the visiting Tolmekians. It's their disregard for that autonomy. As part of their treaty with Tolmekiä, yes, the Valley was meant to come to their aid militarily, but Tolmekiä was supposed to show a certain level of respect. They were supposed to land well outside the Valley in their airships, so as to not inadvertently bring spores that could overtake the delicate agriculture of the region. And their disregard in this, and the supreme disrespect they showed by walking around the area like it was theirs, is what invokes Nausicaa's rage. Her reaction was decisive, it was drastic, but it showed strength. It showed a strength of Nausicaa's character. Unfortunately for the film version, this is also the beginning of some of the issues with Nausicaa's characterization.
Part 4, Nausicaä Warrior Princess, or Xena of the Valley of the Wind if you're nasty.
Nausicaa kicks ass. Honestly, it is one of my favorite things about her, and not because I'm only interested in kick-ass characters, but because that quality of hers feels the most like it was fostered in her upbringing by her father. Jill, the chieftain of the valley, did work to prepare Nausicaä to eventually replace him, even though it would have traditionally fallen to a male heir, which he did not have. And yes, he did have reservations precisely because she was not his son, but he was also practical. He recognized he had no choice, and that ultimately, Nausicaä was his child, and therefore he had faith that she could take up his role when he no longer was around. This is presumably one of the reasons he consented to have Master Yupa teach Nausicaä sword fighting amongst other survivalist lessons in the first place. And though not directly stated in the film, I can imagine that the realization that his daughter must follow him as leader may have caused him to focus on what he presumed she might lack as a woman rather than a man: dads. I think it was Jill who fostered the fierceness of spirit she possesses, but he also counsels her when necessary. In the manga, he tells her to quell her excitement and remain calm because that is what is needed from a leader. They cannot fan the flames of worry in their people, nor escalate the conflict with other nations if it can be avoided. Yet, as much as I think Nausicaä is cool and competent, in the film, she comes off as ultra competent, almost perfect. She's not only the most adept at traveling within the Sea of Corruption, but she revels in it. She finds it beautiful. She doesn't hate it or its inhabitants. Nausicaä is a skilled wind rider, arguably one of the most skilled in the air out of all of the characters we meet in the film. Except maybe Mito, who seems to be of similar skill. The woman can fight. Her swordplay is enough to take out multiple Tolmekian troops quickly. Her skills even include the ability to read the body language of the insects of the Forest of Decay, charm them, or persuade them to do what she needs them to do in a manner that no other characters display at all in the movie. I mentioned earlier that I don't like the change of having the Tolmekians touch down in the valley and then immediately kill the chieftain. One of the biggest reasons I feel that way is because I think it makes an almost untenable reaction from Nausicaä after that initial rage. In the manga, what enrages Nausicaä is that the Tolmekian airships landed right in the valley in flagrant disregard for their treaties. Nausicaä immediately stands up to them and even trades blows with them, drawing her sword. Only Master Yupa's intervention, as in the film, stops the conflict from escalating. And the Tolmekian forces and the valley's forces exist in an uneasy truce after Yupa stops the fight. It is a conflict of butting de facto heads that makes sense. De facto because officially neither woman is their head of state, but Kushana is certainly operating as such, and the valley seems to already accept Nausicaä as their leader. But the film's decision to have this inciting incident between the two be the literal murder of the valley's sovereign leader weakens this positioning between Tolmekiä and the valley. On one hand, I kind of understand why they did it. First, it more neatly ties up Nausicaä and her father's relationship by having him die before she sets out. And secondly, it is a good reason that Nausicaä becomes so enraged, and therefore a good mirror to the introduction of her fox squirrel Tito. Let's take a quick moment to talk about Tito. Tito was introduced after Nausicaä successfully helped Master Yupa escape an ohm that he accidentally enraged because he believed it to be carrying a human baby and shot at it. Instead of a human baby, it was the little fox squirrel, and Nausicaä introduces herself to it. Tito is shown almost feral with anger and rage. He bites Nausicaä, which she allows without complaint, even as it draws blood. Only after realizing that Nausicaä was not going to mindlessly retaliate against its attack does Tito decide Nausicaä is not a threat, and then appears remorseful, even going so far as to lick the wound it just inflicted on her. Now, my first reaction was to hope that for her sake, rabies isn't a thing in this version of the future. But my second reaction was in understanding this to be a metaphor. Tito lashed out in anger and rage, and it is tempting to meet that energy with equal rage, but it was really an expression of fear. And once that was dealt with by showing Tito it had nothing to fear from Nausicaä, then they were able to move past anger and fear and towards understanding and cooperation. The moment Nausicaä realizes her father has been murdered, her anger towards the Tolmekians responsible is supposed to be a mirror to that same anger Tito displayed. In the manga, having her display that anger towards a simpler disrespect of territory fits beautifully with the themes being expressed. But in the film, they literally just murdered your father, the chieftain of the valley. Her backing down then doesn't read as her coming to higher senses. It reads as someone who realizes her actions could cost her people their lives because they are just not strong enough to stand against the Tolmekians. And now, it's not some uneasy truce, but an apparent threat. If the Tolmekians can kill your sovereign leader without any consequence, they could easily do it to Nausicaä, or any number of her people. And that may have been the case in the manga as well, at least implied, but it does change the dynamic significantly between Nausicaä and Kushana. We get shockingly little in terms of Nausicaa's faults in the movie, and this was a situation that could have benefited from lower stakes, not higher stakes, to show those faults more apparently, to remind us that she's human. As it stands, she goes from one impossible situation to another and seems to respond to each instantly, and for the most part, perfectly. She can traverse the Forest of Decay safely, she can charm a rampaging ohm when no one else can, she can fly on her glider or in her airship with unmatched skill, she can fight with swords, she can take on guys shooting at her, she can respond to a crashing airship, attempt to save the girl from Pejite inside the airship, she can befriend a boy from Pejite bent on revenge for his sister in the airship who died previously and who she tried to save, she can understand the sea of corruption and most importantly the insects like they are people when no other characters besides maybe Yupa display any similar capabilities. Where did this characterization come from? Who is Nausicaä really? The character of Nausicaa's origin in Miyazaki's mind came from a character of the same name in Homer's Odyssey. Nausicaa in that story was a young princess who nursed Odysseus back to life. Miyazaki originally encountered this character in a translation of a collection of Greek myths by Bernard Evslin. In both Evslin and Homer's versions, after Odysseus gets well, he leaves the princess to return to his wife. And Nausicaa, a harp player, never marries and instead sings songs and plays her harp. There is a suggestion in some tellings that she traveled around playing her harp and singing and would be potentially the first ever female minstrel. In Suzanne Napier's book, Miyazaki World, A Life in Art, she says, "But her fate also suggests a person inherently alone. A characteristic that Miyazaki may have identified with, both as an introverted young boy lost in reading and art, and in his contemporary adult life as he increasingly shouldered the onerous responsibilities of being a director. She's a solitary figure, one who feels a duty to those around her, but that also seems distant from those very same people. She works with and thinks of others and never stops thinking about those she tried to help. We see this too when we get glimpses into her past of her as a child hiding an ohm she was taking care of from the adults because she knew both that it needed her help and that the adults wouldn't approve of her keeping an ohm as a pet. Nausicaa's ultra competence and compassion make her appear almost Christ-like, especially in the end of the film. Miyazaki himself commented on one of the last scenes of the film in an interview published in May 1984 in reference guides to various animated series and feature films published by Ghibli's parent company, Tokuma Shoten. I didn't intend to make her a Joan of Arc, and I wanted to get rid of any religious undertone, but in the end, it became a religious picture with that scene. I really wavered. What I thought I could draw in a more physical style, perhaps, turned out to look more religious. I do like animism. I can understand the idea of ascribing character to stones or wind, but I didn't want to laud it as a religion. That is why Nausicaä isn't Joan of Arc. She acted for her own sake, not for the sake of those in the Valley of the Wind, but because she could endure no more. Rather than considering the risk to her own life, Nausicaä felt that unless she returned the baby Ohm to the pack, the hole in her heart would never be filled. That's the kind of person I think she is. And I do see shadows of what Miyazaki is talking about. Where I think it falls a little flat in the film is in the lack of those flaws of Nausicaa's character being apparent, and ultimately that the final conflict of the film, a stampede of Ohm, was a threat to the people of the valley. This makes it a lot harder to see her act as one motivated by a selfishness of not being able to stand the pain of the baby Ohm alone, and I'd argue instead paints the picture of the alignment between being unable to stand that Ohm's pain and the benefit to her people by correcting it. Now, to be clear, I like the idea of a message of helping ourselves by helping nature. In fact, I think that's a great message. And the seeds were sown for that message earlier in the film already. That being said, I can't help but feel disappointed in not having Miyazaki's intention of Nausicaa's characterization come across at this climax, both because I think we can still have the message of how helping nature is helping humanity too, and the message that Nausicaä took action for no other reason than not being able to stand herself if she didn't try to help this Ohm. The most compelling characters in my mind are flawed ones that remind us both of the weakness of the human spirit while showcasing its strength in equal measures. There is a subtle tweak I'd make to get that point across. Have the stampede of Ohm that threatened the valley turn their attention towards Dorok. In the Battle of Acid Lake, where the Ohm stampede threat makes itself apparent, Nausicaä and her uncle Mito in the valley's gunship find that the stampede is following a small craft that is hoisting a larvae of the Ohm as bait. Due to Nausicaa's actions, she ends up putting down the small craft and baby Ohm on a small sandbar or island in the middle of this lake of acid that can't be traversed by human or Ohm except by the air. I think this could have been an opportunity to have the stampede lose track of the baby Ohm, and in their confusion, potentially change directions, banking around the Sea of Corruption and heading for Dorok. Or at least make that the apparent direction they turn. Perhaps this is even celebrated by the valley's people who now feel saved. A celebration that now all they have to do is wait for the wave of bugs to reach Dorok's borders, however long that may be away. In other words, make it apparent that Nausicaä no longer needs to take action to protect her people, and she'd have no reason or responsibility to do anything for the benefit of Dorok. If that was the situation, her choosing to help the baby Ohm anyway at great risk to herself and potentially even the valley if the reintroduction of the baby Ohm caused the stampede to once again change direction, that would absolutely speak to the kind of person she is. She would be the type of person who wants to calm the Ohm because it is the right thing to do, and in recognition that the Ohm, and especially this baby Ohm, are innocents in the scenario. Yet that's not what happened. Instead, it appears that she is once again the perfect leader and was able to save her people, the Tolmekians, the Ohm, and even the Sea of Corruption, which, by the way, is not as terrible as humanity believes it to be.
Part 5. Nature. Not always nurturing, but life finds a way.
Bugs is good, actually. Unpalatable though they may be. Giant bugs even. And I could say that, not because I'm a bug, but because we are lucky enough to live in this reality where even the largest bugs are not Ohm-sized. But bugs play an important role in life on planet Earth and have for a long time, and will for a long time still. Bugs are just one part of the role nature plays in Nausicaä. The Sea of Corruption, or the Forest of Decay, is an area of the continent completely inhospitable to humanity. I've mentioned that to safely traverse it, humans need specialized equipment to protect them from what is known as the miasma. Miasma is simply the airborne particles that are extremely toxic to humans. It is a combination of the bugs, the miasma, and the spores of the fungus or the seeds of plant life itself that humans fear about the Sea of Corruption. And most humans believe that those are the elements that are toxic. However, that's not actually the case. We learn the truth when Master Yupa finds out that Nausicaä has a secret room in the valley's castle where she is growing plants from the sea.
Don't worry, the plants aren't poisonous.
They're not poisonous? It's true, the air is pure in here.
Originally, Nausicaä began experimenting with the plant life there as a means to help her father, who was succumbing to the sickness common to those who live close to the sea. However, by drawing clean water and soil from deep underground the castle and irrigating the plants with that instead of the earth found in the forest, the plants show themselves to not be toxic. Nausicaä explains to Yupa that it's the very soil itself that is toxic, and that is what makes the plants dangerous. Something is wrong with the earth. In fact, the valley's own topsoil is polluted by this same toxic source, with Nausicaä being confused as to who could or would have polluted the entirety of the earth. As she is being forced to leave the valley, and given that the purpose of cultivating these plants was to find a cure for her father, who is now dead at the hands of the Tolmekians, Nausicaä tells Yupa that she has already cut off the water and eventually the plants in her secret room will wither and die. It's not until later that we learn the extent of the misunderstanding of the source of toxicity when Nausicaä and Asbel fall into quicksand after Nausicaä saves Asbel from a large insect in the forest that he's enraged with gunfire. Asbel attacked the Tolmekian forces because he's from Pejite and is attacking them out of vengeance for what they did to both the city and his sister, who Nausicaä tried to save earlier in the film. They both get pulled deep under the forest by the falling sand, and Nausicaä awakens to find a safe zone. Not only are there no insects raging this deep below the Sea of Corruption, but the air is miasma-free. And even the water they find there is pure. After some investigation, Nausicaä realizes the plants of the toxic jungle are pulling the pollution out of the earth, dying, and then turning to sand to serve as new nutrients in the soil for more plants to continue the cycle. She explains that the process will take a long time, but the insects have become protective of the forest precisely because they understand the forest as an important part of the process of repairing the damage to the earth. It's not that the insects understand this on a scientific level, but more of an instinctual level. Asbel is amazed to learn of this, but he believes it will take too long, stating that humans will never survive the insects in the time it will take for the soil to be purified. And he's so focused on getting rid of the forest to help humanity survive that it prompts Nausicaä to say he and the people of Pejite are no better than the Tolmekians if this is how they think. Which, of course, angers Asbel, but she doesn't bother defending the position. The truth is that Asbel didn't understand her explanation at all. He is so committed to viewing the Sea of Corruption as an enemy and an obstacle of humanity that he doesn't realize that what he proposes would be counterproductive. To him, her explanation is a side effect of the forest's existence, and its true goal and purpose is to harbor toxins and bugs that are slowly but surely putting an end to humanity. The opposite is true, though. Nausicaä is explaining the mechanism by which the world could heal and no longer be toxic in the first place. And the insects that inhabit and protect the forest are an important part of that process, slow though it may be. In other words, she understands there is no alternative to having the forest repair the pollution, and it makes for an interesting parallel to the Chico nuts she shares with Asbel. He tries one, having never had one before, and says they taste awful, and asks Nausicaä about them. She explains that they are supposed to be good for you, and she happily eats some and shares some with Tito, who similarly eats them without complaint. Not that Tito would complain. In isolation, this leads to a cute moment where he eats the rest of the Chico nuts in his hand and asks why things that are good for you have to taste so bad. Connecting this to the cycle of purification that the forest is under, we get the message that the thing that is good for you in the long run may sometimes be distasteful at its onset. In other words, though it may be difficult to imagine humanity surviving the bugs and the toxins of the forest, if humans are to one day have a world without the fear of the Sea of Corruption, it must be through this process. There can be no shortcuts, no matter how difficult or distasteful that must seem. And the reason is simply that any path that targets the forest for annihilation is also targeting the process by which the waters of the world are purified. The valley pulls their water from deep underground, presumably from this same large source of purified water. Destroying the forest may sound like a good idea if you only understand the forest on the surface level, but in truth, it would be as good as signing a death warrant for all those who rely on this source of water. Without the forest, there would be no hope for purification. Without the insects, the forest itself would be undefended. And even if that were not the case, the deeper truth that no one seems to want to face head-on is that the forest and bugs are not the biggest threat to humanity. It is humanity itself that continues to wage war and fight over resources and even look to the past for power in a ceaseless arms race. The largest powers in the conflict, the likes of the Tolmekians or those of Dorok, understand the bugs and the sea as a force moving against humanity rather than a symbiotic relationship that could heal the planet. And not just heal it from some unknown contaminant, but from the actions of ancient humanity that soured the soil in the first place. Unfortunately, it's not just the likes of Asbel or Pejite that Nausicaä must contend with. She runs into opposition from a variety of human sources.
Part 6. Nausicaä versus Human Nature.
This film has been lauded as a story about environmental justice, but I've been hinting throughout this video that I think that is ultimately reductive. Environmental justice is of course a huge part of this movie's message, but it's really a subject by which we can examine the true conflict, human nature itself, and ultimately the ways in which each generation must pick up while the previous generation is still working, and how that transition while in motion leads to a staining of the new hands with the blood passed down by the old. This movie isn't Nausicaä as the sole member of the new generation taking her place, but Nausicaä as one of a few presented. Nausicaä is the next generation of leadership in the valley, but we also have the twins, Lastel and Asbel from Pejite, who are also stepping into roles with their people, and more notably, Kushana, who serves as another potential version of Nausicaä put into different circumstances. This is a story that is held as an opportunity, where the old leaders wane and lose favor, new leadership can step up. But the question is whether they will simply continue the mantle of missteps of their predecessors, or if they can step into a new direction, and if they can convince those they'd like to lead to follow them down that new path. Nausicaä is clearly someone who feels great reverence for her father, for Master Yupa, and the like. Yet she too is shown struggling against tradition in flashbacks where she protected a young Ohm from the adults of the valley who viewed them as creatures of the toxic jungle and omens of bad tidings, rather than individual beings with their own right to life and safety. Asbel is a young man who is pulled into conflict directly at the act of his sister's abduction by the Tolmekians, and his desire to avenge her upon her death. Even unable to connect with his late sister and her likely wishes, as she held strong convictions and attempted to halt the Tolmekians from seizing control of the god warrior her people unearthed below their city. But it's with Kushana who I find the most thematic relevance to our protagonist. Lastel dies almost immediately after her introduction, and her brother, Asbel, doesn't appear until much later in the film, and though he has a couple of cute interactions with Nausicaä, they don't have much rapport with one another, and she separates from him soon after. Kushana, by contrast, is a presence throughout a large portion of the film, and she is one that seems to change throughout, especially when comparing herself to Nausicaä. Both Nausicaä and Kushana are the sole surviving children of their respective fathers, with Nausicaa's father being the chieftain or king of the Valley of the Wind, and Kushana's the previous emperor of Tolmekia. But where Kushana was displaced, Nausicaä was not. Still, Kushana worked to live up to her lineage and establish her own power, knowing her stepfather would not provide her any such opportunity, and that he was actively working against her. Kushana, for her part, seems to respect Nausicaä fairly early on, as she sees Nausicaä as not just a princess of words, but she's able to combat her soldiers and even kill them. Sure, Nausicaä may back down due to an understanding of the valley's military might, paling in comparison to Kushana's Tolmekian forces. But she does not back down in temperament, and even shows Kushana up several times, saving her life as the Tolmekian transport they are on goes down. I'd argue that you can see the effects of this relationship on Kushana in her change of attire throughout the film. She starts off covered in armor, a clear sign that not only is she ready to throw down, but that she's also very guarded, unwilling to face the world and its threat because she feels she must protect herself. But as the film progresses, she slowly sheds parts of her armor, becoming more comfortable without it, in a mirror of Nausicaä, who stands and is ready to fight, but wears no armor herself. And even as she takes charge of the giant god warrior to fight off the stampede of Ohm, she seems to have some interest and compassion towards Nausicaä in particular, as she tells her soldiers to hold their fire when Nausicaa's gunship returns, and runs up personally while shots are still being rung out to make sure Nausicaä is okay. She's clearly touched by Nausicaä and even seems to want to show the same level of strength and fierceness. Yet she is not like Nausicaä, because Nausicaä had the acceptance of her family and her people, something denied to Kushana through no real fault of her own. And as Kushana cannot really overcome the issue of her gender, she instead turns to the only method she can think of to gain some semblance of the power she is denied, seizing power when it is within her grasp. Due to this desperation, she tries to use the giant god warrior before it can truly regenerate into its rightful glory. And though it does have one demonstration of its power, in the end that one shot was its last, as it melts into an organic puddle of goop before her very eyes. Same. One wonders what the cooperation between the likes of Kushana and Nausicaä might have brought her, instead of the only instruments she knew how to use for the purpose of taking charge, instruments of death and power. In Kushana's desperation to seize what is being denied to her, she foolishly thinks she must pursue it through the same methods as those who are currently taking it from her, through war and conquest, instead of looking to the organic type of leadership Nausicaä was able to instill into her people. Leadership through love, which would likely be considered weak and unsightly to the likes of her stepfather, whatever that's worth. Yet Nausicaä shows its true power again and again. It's in the comparison between Kushana and Nausicaä that I see something bigger than just a message about we must protect the environment. In fact, at no point does Nausicaä truly protect the environment in an abstract sense. She protects individuals who make it up. She protects the baby Ohm, but she also saves Kushana's life. She also risks her own life by taking off her mask to talk directly to some of her people who survived Asbel's assault on the Tolmekian airship. Their fear made the prospect of landing in the sea of corruption something they wanted to avoid so strongly that they even suggest jumping to their deaths. But she takes off her mask to show them her fear is low, and to speak directly to them with the goal of easing the fears of the jungle. Even as she risks breathing in the miasma, she is willing to put her life on the line to ease her people's fears and to get them to cooperate. One wonders if this is the kind of leadership her father demonstrated, and whether this was part of the reason he began to get as sick as he did. It's unlikely that such a self-sacrificing nature is the only reason he got sick, given that even the topsoil in the valley is polluted, but his sickness appears more pronounced than the other such members of the valley. Nausicaä clearly learned from the leaders of the past in understanding that addressing her people directly is the best way to ease their fears and to get them to follow her lead. And that approach has clearly led to the love and devotion she receives from her people, something Kushana definitely takes note of and perhaps envies. And that's not to say Kushana has no one in her corner. Her own soldiers are devoted to her, clearly because she is a strong military commander, much like they expect. Heck, her adherence to military strength and the conquest of her people even lead her to consider setting up shop right here in the periphery with her own kingdom, with the giant god warrior as the center of her power. One wonders if she is inspired by the type of kingdom that Nausicaä keeps, where her people show themselves to be loyal. Yet she can't divorce herself entirely from the tactics of her people, and in understanding that she must carve out her own sphere of influence if she wants to have one, She's willing to take a place of her own and, if pressed, defend it. Which is what I believe her to be doing with the giant god warrior. She activates it before it is ready, not to show the world the might of Tomekia, but to defend this area from the insects that are threatening it. Something I think she may have been inspired to do by Nausicaä herself. The truth was that Tomekia didn't give two shits about the periphery. They only cared in whatever they could gain, even as they took the god warrior from Pejite. Kushana's orders were to return it to Tomekia, something that she could not do in haste because even their largest airship couldn't carry the god warrior. It makes me wonder if they ever believed in its might, or if they thought of it too as an errand meant to occupy her time while they moved on Dorok. And in that way, I can kind of see a kinship Kushana may have felt between her and the God Warrior itself. Both are symbols of an old power, the God Warrior being the power of the old world, and Kushana being the last remnant of the prior emperor. Both discounted as relics of the past. Is Kushana at the end of the film going to experience the same fate as the God Warrior at being unleashed before she was ready? And whatever power being held falling through her fingers like sand, or like the very flesh off the God Warrior's bones. But we hear her urge the God Warrior on. She orders it to attack, and when it hesitates, she asks if it is not descended from Earth's most evil tribe, a sort of urging onward by calling to mind its heritage. Can it not attack? Can it not rouse the power gifted to it from its very existence? Better yet, can she? Is she not descended from the powerful Tomekian kingdom? A kingdom that is the largest remnant of the kingdom of Eftal. Does she not inherit its mantle by being the daughter of one of the Tomekian emperors? The people of the valley don't think much of Kushana. She's not their princess. And even if she were to conquer them in earnest, she'd never be. Nausicaä is a wind rider who understands the land, and though she can fight, it's her connection to the land and its people that give her the right to rule them, not a show of strength. Yet Kushana and Asbel are alike in Nausicaa's mind, and I think the rub is that Nausicaä considers herself to be like them too. Earlier in the film, as she is ready to depart, she cries in Master Yupa's arms because she is frightened of herself. She frightened herself in what she was willing to do in her rage after the death of her father. And in the end, it all comes back to that moment with Tito. Kushana blusters and grasps at power because she's afraid of what the Tomekian order under her stepfather and her brothers would do to rid themselves of her, of a world where she has no place. Asbel is afraid of losing those closest to him. He's afraid of the Forest of Decay and the insects within it, and he's willing to attack Tomekian troops and burn the jungle because his fear is so strong. Even as Nausicaä tries to explain the Forest of Decay is the solution to the pollution of the planet. Nausicaä recognizes this fear in them because she's seen it in herself. And in the end, that's what Nausicaä is about. It is a message of not giving into fear, of not letting the ways we learn to fear one another cloud our judgment, of not allowing ourselves to be willing to kill in the name of that fear. Tomekia fears Dorok. That's why they wage war against it. They fear what it will do to them if they don't strike first. The Vai Emperor of Tomekia fears Kushana, so he sends her away and has her wage war on the peripheral states. Kushana fears her own displacement in the world, so she attacks and shows strength to make a place for herself. Asbel fears the death of more loved ones, of the loss of his entire people and their ways. That's why he attacks Tomekian troops in revenge, and why he wants to take the God Warrior for himself and destroy the toxic jungle he also fears. In fact, he fears even the knowledge that humanity's best chance at survival is learning to live with the bugs, and realizing they protect the forest which purifies the ground and water. He fears it so much that he would still burn it down. Nausicaä herself exists as a symbol of a person who is not fearless, but who tries to understand her fear, and who is willing to put herself in harm's way despite that fear. Something her father instilled in her. And it makes me return to that Miyazaki quote from Yomu in June of 1994 as to what he was thinking when he started Nausicaä all those years ago.
Part 7. In conclusion, it all comes back to fear.
One thing I do remember well, however, is that I was extremely irritated at the time. I confess I was angry about the general state of the world, among other things. It was right around 1980. In addition to being upset by environmental problems, I was also concerned about where humanity was headed, and especially about the state of Japan. Most of all, I suspect, I was angered by the state of my own self. I feel this quote deeply in my bones. I feel fear today, and I'm angry too. I'm angry about the state of the world. I'm angry about the voices of cruelty that are being exalted right now. It's tempting to give into that anger. It's tempting to want to lash out. I'm angry at so many people and groups and concepts and abstractions, but I think I'm also angry at the state I find myself in. There are a lot of people in this world right now who have a lot to be angry at. Now, I patently reject the idea that we should not be angry. In fact, that feels like a huge reason why I get frustrated with Nausicaä the character. Besides her being presented as this paragon of a person that can lead the world out of such states of darkness, it's in the ways that the film forgets to remind us of her anger, because I think it was there throughout. Unlike a lot of the stereotypical depictions of anime, this is not a story where we hear the thoughts of characters. We know what they think only through the hints of their actions and the words they may express their feelings in. Nausicaä was motivated to not act in anger because of her own fear of what she'd be willing to do early on in the story. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to say she didn't have anger at Kushana for how they treated her and the people of the valley, or Asbel's fixation on destroying the forest, or even those soldiers of Dorak who harmed the baby Om. In truth, Nausicaa's strength is in how invisible her struggle was with her own anger as she chose constructive paths every time. And perhaps it's out of a sense of envy that I find that depiction frustrating, or perhaps it's the knowledge that Nausicaä isn't real, and that her actions and her struggles are the choices of people outside her world entirely. Perhaps I'm not frustrated with Nausicaä that she doesn't visibly struggle the way I do day to day, but that I'm frustrated with Miyazaki himself for choosing to depict her in this way, for making a character who feels so unrealistic in this solemn strength and ability to act, because it makes me feel like that is true strength, when the truth is that strength is the ability to meet our feelings head on and not let them push us to rash action, but inform the choices that lead to the best outcome for everybody. This movie was made in a very different time for a very different audience, but its message is applicable today. Humanity is often at a crossroad, and we find ourselves here yet again. The question becomes whether we let our fear inform our choices or dictate them. It seems the easy solutions are the ones that our fear finds, but the ones that are the best for us are different. Now, that's not to say it's as simple as, let's all get along, or we can cooperate with anyone. The truth is, though the giant insects can harm people in Nausicaä, they are important to the ecosystem, as is the forest that is deadly to humans. But people are not insects. There are those who commit atrocities. Nausicaä doesn't work or cooperate with them, she defeats them. She just doesn't allow her fear and anger to dictate how she treats them in defeat. In the world today, we still have people who have been in power for decades, who ruled through fear, who incite it in others, who use fear as a weapon, who present the easy solution to mitigate our fear as the right solution for the longevity and the betterment of the world itself. They are not allies, they are opponents, as the new guard of leadership steps up to wrest that power away. And even though not all of us will be a part of things at a global scale, this is true down to the smallest units of society too. Even the individual people of the valley, though not fighters, though not strong, call Kushana's actions what they are. They had faith in Nausicaä and followed her lead because they could see it too. They could feel the difference between being led by fear and what Nausicaa's leadership offers them, and Nausicaa's own understanding that she is not immune to fear or anger reminds us all to make that determination for ourselves. To be quite honest, this is not one of my favorite Ghibli films. I have some issues with it from a film perspective. I think my feelings on where they missed on Nausicaa's characterization are apparent at this point, but some other issues that come to mind are that I think there are some clarity issues around Dorak's involvement. The soundtrack is not amazing. That La 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 song for the flashbacks and in relation to the Om is a song that both gets in my head and I can't stand. Like seriously, it gives me Nessa Wilder vibes. But overall, I can forgive that given the constraints of making a film like this, and how early it is in their works. If you've seen their more recent films, you'll know Ghibli's sound design improves tremendously. But even if it is not my favorite, it is still really good. And the world Miyazaki came up with, the conflict he orchestrated within it, and the themes are really worthwhile. We have Nausicaä to thank for all the business reasons Ghibli exists, but we also have it to thank for being such a powerful story, and one where you can see the lessons the studio, Miyazaki, the team, everybody learned. Not just the lessons of filmmaking, but also lessons of understanding the kinds of stories that speak to us, and bringing them to life like no other studio does. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this exploration of Nausicaä. I know I did.
'Cause I know I did.
If you liked the video and want to see more stuff from me, please consider giving me the old like and subscribe. I'll be doing deep dives into more Ghibli movies and other things, who knows what else, as time allows. Thank you, and good night. Goodbye.